There is a particular kind of silence that follows the moment you realize you have outgrown the world you were born into. Not a peaceful silence. Not the silence of satisfaction. It is the silence of standing at the edge of something vast and incomprehensible, looking out and knowing with a certainty that precedes language that you are not finished. That whatever this was, whatever you have done, whatever they said was the limit, is not the limit. That the limit is somewhere else, somewhere you can't yet see, but you can feel. Napoleon Bonaparte knew that silence before he was 20 years old. He knew it in the way only the truly dangerous know things. Not as a thought, not as an ambition he could articulate to others, but as a physical fact about the shape of his own interior life. There was more inside him than the world had yet found use for. And that gap, between what he contained and what the world had permitted him to express, was not something he was willing to accept as permanent. Most people accept it. Most people feel that gap close over the years, like a wound healing into scar tissue. They make peace. They find smaller satisfactions. They tell themselves a story about contentment. And in that story, the gap disappears. Not because it closed, but because they stopped measuring it. Napoleon never stopped measuring. This is not a story about military genius, though we will come to that. It is not a story about tactics or campaigns or the mechanics of empire. Those things happened and they matter, but they are not the center. The center is something more uncomfortable. The inner life of a man who refused to accept the world as he found it, who bent an entire civilization to the shape of his will, who rose from absolute obscurity to become the most powerful individual on earth, and who in doing so discovered something that no amount of power could resolve. That discovery is what this story is really about. But to understand it, we have to go back, not to the battles, not to the coronation, not to the famous portraits with the hand tucked inside the coat. We have to go back to a small island at the edge of the Mediterranean, to a house where a family of 8 children ate together in a room that smelled of stone and salt air, to a boy who was already preparing in his mind for a life he could not yet name. Corsica, 1769. The island had been sold by Genoa to France that same year, less than a year before Napoleon was born. His father, Carlo, was a minor noble of Italian descent, not wealthy, not powerful, barely landed. His mother, Letizia, was by all accounts extraordinary, fierce, stoic, capable of a severity that her children would remember their whole lives without quite understanding where it came from. She had little patience for weakness. In the Corsican tradition, she did not believe in shielding children from the difficulty of existence. You looked at reality and you stood up to it. That was the deal. Napoleon absorbed this early. He absorbed it in ways he could not have articulated and may not have been fully conscious of. The emotional architecture of his later life, the relentless forward motion, the intolerance for stagnation, the near total absence of self-pity, and the strange recurring inability to simply rest, all of it traces back to that house. Those early years, that mother who expected her children to be hard, but there was something else too. Something that complicated the hardness. Napoleon was not popular as a child. He was Corsican in a French school, foreign in his accent and his sensibility, visibly different from the boys around him at the military academy at Brienne, where he was sent at 9 years old on a scholarship. 9 years old and already alone in the way that some children are alone, not from shyness, but from a kind of excess of interiority. There was too much happening inside him for the social world of other children to absorb. He read constantly, history, mostly, Plutarch, ancient military strategy, the lives of great men. He was looking for something in those pages, searching with the focused desperation of someone who already suspects, without quite knowing why, that the answer to the most important question is not going to be found in the immediate environment. The most important question for Napoleon was already forming in those years. It was not how do I succeed. It was not how do I become powerful. It was older than those questions, more existential, more personal. What am I capable of? What is the outermost limit of what I, specifically, can do? He needed to know. That need would never leave him. Have you ever asked yourself that question, not rhetorically, not as a motivational exercise, but genuinely? Not what am I good at, but what is the absolute frontier of my capacity? Most of us haven't. Most of us have absorbed, quietly and without noticing, the general consensus that our potential is roughly similar to the people around us, that the distribution of human ability is fairly flat. That extraordinary achievement is mostly circumstance, mostly luck, mostly the accident of birth into the right family or the right country at the right time. Napoleon did not believe this. He believed, and this belief was not arrogance so much as a deep, almost scientific conviction, that the gap between what most people achieved and what was actually possible was enormous. Vast. A canyon, not a step, and he intended to cross it. What no one could have predicted, watching that lonely Corsican boy at his books in the cold dormitory at Brienne, was that he was right. This is what makes Napoleon so difficult to absorb. We know intellectually that extraordinary people exist. We know that some minds operate at a different register than others. But Napoleon presents a kind of evidence that is almost too large to hold comfortably. The sheer scope of what he accomplished, not just the military campaigns, but the legal codes, the institutions, the transformation of European governance, the rewriting of what power could look like in a post-monarchical world, confronts us with something that our ordinary frameworks for human potential simply cannot accommodate. And that confrontation is uncomfortable, because if Napoleon was possible, then the flat distribution we've quietly assumed is wrong. And if it's wrong, then we have to ask ourselves something we'd rather not ask, but we're getting ahead of the story. At 15, Napoleon was at the École Militaire in Paris. He was small, the famous height, whatever it actually was, the question we'll address properly when we get there, and still foreign, still slightly apart. He graduated in 1 year what typically took 2. His examiner, Laplace, the great mathematician, noted his ability, not warmly, with something more like caution. There is a particular register in which very intelligent people describe other very intelligent people whom they suspect of being more intelligent than themselves. That register contains a kind of careful understatement, a deliberate withholding of enthusiasm. Laplace used that register when he described the young artillery officer from Corsica. Napoleon was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery at 16. He returned to Corsica. He read. He wrote. He developed strong opinions about Corsican independence. He wrote to Rousseau, who did not reply. He admired Paoli, the Corsican nationalist leader, and then fell out with him in a way that was deeply personal. Paoli essentially told the young Bonaparte that he belonged to a different era, that he was too modern, too ambitious, too French-educated to be genuinely Corsican. That judgment landed hard, perhaps harder than Napoleon ever fully acknowledged, because Paoli was pointing at something real. Napoleon was neither fully Corsican nor fully French. He was something in between, something new. A man who did not quite belong to the world that had made him. And what you do with that condition, the condition of not quite fitting into any of the available categories, determines, to a very large degree, the shape of your life. Some people who don't fit the categories collapse under the pressure of that unfitting. They spend their lives trying to become legible to the world that rejected them, calibrating and recalibrating, shrinking into forms they can inhabit. And some people decide that if the available categories are insufficient, they will make new ones. Napoleon made new ones. This is where the story begins to accelerate. The revolution broke open France in ways that no one had fully predicted. The old hierarchies of birth, of blood, of inherited title cracked. And in the chaos, new hierarchies began to form. Hierarchies of talent, of nerve, of the willingness to act when others were still deliberating. Napoleon was 24 when he took the artillery at Toulon and, through a combination of tactical insight and sheer force of will, engineered the recapture of the city from the British in 1793. He was noticed, promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old. 24. Let that settle for a moment. Not as a fact about Napoleon's precocity, but as a fact about what that moment cost him in terms of his relationship to ordinary time. Once you have achieved, at 24, something that most men never achieve at any age, you have set a pace. You have established for yourself and for the world watching you a standard. And that standard does not become less demanding with time, it becomes more so. Because now you are not only trying to do what you haven't done before, you are trying to remain equal to who you were. The weight of that, the ongoing project of remaining equal to your own history, is something Napoleon would carry for the rest of his life, and it is perhaps the most human thing about him. There is a question that serious historians of Napoleon always eventually arrive at, and it is not a question about battles or constitutions or diplomatic correspondence. It is a question about the nature of will itself, about whether certain human beings are simply different in the fundamental machinery of their agency, in the way desire connects to action, in the gap, or absence of gap, between wanting something and moving toward it. Most people experience will as something intermittent. It comes and goes. There are days when you can do the hard thing, and days when you can't. There are projects you start with genuine energy that slowly dissipate over weeks and months as the initial excitement fades and the difficulty of sustained effort becomes visible. This is normal. This is the baseline human experience of will. Napoleon did not experience will this way. The people who worked closest to him, his secretaries, his marshals, the men who literally slept in the same room with him during campaigns, all describe independently the same phenomenon. They describe a man who seemed to have access to a reservoir of directed energy that did not empty, who could dictate several complex letters on completely different subjects simultaneously, shifting between them without apparent effort, who could sleep for 3 or 4 hours and wake with his mind already running at full capacity, who, in the middle of a campaign that would have broken most men's concentration entirely, would pause and work on legislation, on the details of a new legal code, on the administrative reorganization of a conquered territory. His secretary, Bourrienne, who was with him for years and whose memoirs are both admiring and distinctly unflattering in places, writes with something approaching bewilderment about Napoleon's capacity for sustained attention, not just to large things, to everything, the details, the precise numbers, the names of individual soldiers mentioned in dispatches, the price of grain in a specific market he had visited once 5 years earlier. This is not simply a good memory. Or rather, it is not only a good memory. It is something more integrated than that, a kind of total engagement with reality that treated no piece of information as irrelevant, a mind that was always at every scale, simultaneously building its model of the world. Where does will like that come from? The historians offer partial answers. Genetics, certainly. The Bonaparte family contains several people of unusual energy and intelligence. Early poverty, possibly. The hunger of those who come from nothing tends to stay in the body even after the material conditions have changed, shaping a relationship to effort and acquisition that abundance alone cannot displace. The particular psychological formation of the exile, the outsider, the man who knows that the path to belonging runs through achievement and only through achievement. But these explanations feel incomplete. They explain why Napoleon was motivated. They don't quite explain the mechanism, the actual inner structure of how that motivation translated, moment by moment, into action. Here is what I think, and I offer this carefully as an interpretation rather than a fact. Napoleon had almost uniquely solved the problem of self-doubt in a way that most people never solve it. Not by eliminating self-doubt, he had doubts, real ones in private moments we will come to later, but by placing it somewhere outside the operational zone. His doubts did not interrupt his functioning. He had, it seems, built a kind of internal architecture in which uncertainty about outcome and confidence in the act of attempting were held in separate chambers. He could know he might fail and act as if he could not. This is rarer than it sounds. Most people's self-doubt and their willingness to act are located in the same room. When doubt rises, action falters. The two processes interfere with each other. Napoleon had somehow, through temperament, through training, through the specific kind of lonely self-reliance that a Corsican boy at a French school develops just to survive, separated them. And that separation was, perhaps, the core of his power. Consider what this meant operationally. When Napoleon made a decision in battle, a decision that might kill thousands of men, including men he knew personally and valued, he made it with a completeness that his opponents consistently found unnerving. They expected hesitation. They expected the ordinary human need to revisit, to second-guess, to allow doubt to soften the edge of commitment. Napoleon didn't give them that, he decided. And then he did not revisit. His opponent at Austerlitz, the joint Austro-Russian force under the nominal command of Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis II, had numerical superiority. They knew he was tired. His forces had been marching for weeks. The conventional strategic wisdom said that Napoleon should be cautious, should consolidate, should wait for better conditions. Napoleon invited them to attack. He deliberately weakened his own right flank, visibly in a way that could be observed, to draw the Allied force toward it. He understood that their commanders, looking at what appeared to be an exposed position, would be unable to resist. And while they moved to exploit the apparent weakness, he struck at their center, splitting their army in two. 2/3 of the Allied force was destroyed. The rest fled. It was, by almost every military historical judgment, as perfect a battle as has ever been fought. But here is what I want you to notice about Austerlitz, because it reveals something about Napoleon's mind that goes beyond tactics. To execute that maneuver, He had to be willing to accept enormous risk on his right flank. Real risk. The kind of risk that, if his reading of the enemy commander's psychology had been wrong, would have led to catastrophic defeat. He was not making a safe decision dressed up as a bold one. He was making an actually dangerous decision because his model of the enemy's decision-making process gave him high confidence that they would behave in a specific way. He was betting on his understanding of other minds, on his ability to see, from inside his own perspective, what another person would do when presented with a particular situation. This is a form of intelligence that military theory calls coup d'œil, literally stroke of the eye, the ability to read a battlefield and a situation whole, to see the essential structure of a problem in the first moment of encounter, rather than arriving at it through laborious analysis. Napoleon had coup d'œil to a degree that even other brilliant commanders described as almost frightening. But what he had beyond the military application was a coup d'œil of human psychology. He could see very quickly what a person wanted, what they feared, what illusion they most needed to maintain about themselves, and he could use that knowledge with surgical precision. This was not cynicism. Not exactly. It was a kind of radical empiricism about human nature. Napoleon did not sentimentalize people. He did not pretend that they were more rational, more consistent, or more noble than they actually were. He looked at what they did, not what they said, and drew conclusions. And his conclusions were, more often than not, accurate. Have you ever noticed how much of what we call leadership failure is actually a failure of accurate perception, a refusal to see people as they are rather than as you need them to be? Napoleon almost never made that mistake with people he was studying as opponents or subjects. He made it, later, with people he loved. But that is a different chapter. The machinery of his governance was as remarkable as his military genius, and the two were connected by the same underlying principle: relentless, unsentimentalized clarity about what actually produces results. He had no patience for systems that existed because they had always existed. He cared only about whether something worked, and worked meant not just as functional, but as optimal, approaching as closely as possible the theoretical maximum of what a given system could achieve. When Napoleon came to power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, the moment when the Directory fell and the consulate rose, and he moved from general to ruler, the French state was in a condition that can only be described as barely coherent. Years of revolutionary upheaval had produced a tangle of conflicting laws, abolished institutions and not yet replaced ones, regional variations that made commerce and governance nearly impossible, and a financial system that had effectively collapsed. He inherited chaos. Within 5 years, he had given France the Civil Code, later called the Napoleonic Code. He had reorganized the educational system. He had established the Banque de France. He had negotiated the Concordat with the Pope, restoring the formal relationship between the French state and the Catholic Church while ensuring that the state retained ultimate authority. He had reformed the military conscription system, the tax system, the system of prefectures that organized regional administration. He had negotiated the Peace of Amiens. The scale of this administrative achievement, pursued simultaneously with ongoing military operations, diplomatic negotiations with most of the powers of Europe, and the management of a political environment in which there were multiple genuine threats to his life and power, is almost difficult to comprehend. Not because any one piece of it was beyond any capable administrator or legislator, but because the combination, sustained at that intensity, for that duration, by essentially one directing intelligence, that is what defies ordinary categories. His minister Talleyrand, one of the most brilliantly cynical observers in the history of European politics, wrote in his memoirs that working with Napoleon was like standing too close to a very large fire, warming, illuminating, and you had to be constantly careful not to be consumed. That image, the fire, is one that several of Napoleon's contemporaries reached for independently. It suggests something important, that the people around him experienced his will not as an imposition, but as a force of nature, something that didn't have the texture of human choice, but of something more elemental. The fire doesn't decide to burn, it burns, and yet he was a man. He was a man who wrote letters to his wife in which the grammar sometimes broke down entirely, overwhelmed by feeling. A man who at the height of his power would sometimes fall into moods of unusual stillness that his staff had learned to treat as something between meditation and depression. A man who in the middle of major military operations occasionally took ill with physical symptoms that doctors of the time attributed to nerves and that modern historians suggest may have been psychosomatic, his body doing what his mind refused to allow, expressing the enormous cost of that sustained, relentless, seemingly inexhaustible forward motion. The fire burned, but it was not without cost. There is a moment in the Egyptian campaign which we will return to in depth, because Egypt reveals so much where Napoleon is riding through the desert and he becomes briefly lost. His escort has gotten ahead of him. He is alone in the sand, at night, with no clear sense of direction, and the account of that night from a soldier who found him and who described what he saw contains something that doesn't quite fit the image. Napoleon sitting very still on his horse in the moonlight, not moving, not issuing orders, not doing anything at all, just sitting, looking at the sky. The soldier didn't know what to make of it. He said Napoleon looked in that moment like a man who had forgotten something important and was trying to remember what it was. I've thought about that image for a long time. What was he looking for in the sky alone in the Egyptian desert? Was it the question again, the old question, the measuring question, what is the limit? And was the answer, somewhere in that dark and silent vastness, beginning to be, I don't know. I don't know if there is one. In 1798, Napoleon was 28 years old and already the most celebrated general in Europe. He had just returned from the Italian campaign, which had been, by any measure, a revelation. He had taken an army that was underfed, undersupplied, and demoralized, and with it had conquered most of northern Italy, forced peace terms on Austria, and remade the political map of the peninsula in ways that the professional diplomats in Paris had thought required decades and multiple major powers. He had done it in less than 2 years, mostly on instinct and improvisation, against armies led by commanders with far more experience and far larger reputations. He came back to Paris as a hero. The crowds were enormous. The Directory, which was watching his popularity with undisguised anxiety, was eager to give him something that would take him far from France and its domestic politics. Egypt seemed ideal. The official rationale for the Egyptian expedition was strategic: disrupt British trade routes to India, establish a French presence in the eastern Mediterranean, threaten British colonial interests. The Directory sold this to the public and to Napoleon himself as a serious geopolitical operation. But I want to pause here because the Egyptian expedition is one of those moments in history that rewards a second, slower look. Because the expedition was not only strategic, not for Napoleon. For him it was something more personal, more strange, something that illuminates a dimension of his inner life that gets overshadowed by the tactical genius. Napoleon had, from his reading of Plutarch as a child, a deep and abiding fascination with Alexander the Great. This is documented not as historical speculation, but as something Napoleon himself acknowledged in conversation and in his own writings. He had read about Alexander's conquest of Persia, of Egypt, of Central Asia, of the Indus Valley. He had read about Alexander standing at the edge of the known world and weeping, according to one tradition, because there were no more worlds to conquer. That image had stayed with Napoleon. Of course it had stayed with him. It was his story, told in advance by a man who had lived it 2,000 years earlier. The man who conquers everything available and then stands at the edge of the available, looking outward, feeling something that cannot quite be called satisfaction, because satisfaction implies completion, and completion implies stopping. Egypt was, for Napoleon, a meeting with his own myth. He took with him not only soldiers but scientists, 167 scholars, mathematicians, chemists, astronomers, linguists, botanists, physicians, artists. The Commission des Sciences et des Arts. He created, in the middle of a military expedition, an institute of Egyptian study. They catalogued, measured, drew, analyzed. The Description de l'Égypte, the monumental publication that resulted from their work, would eventually run to 23 volumes and reshape the European understanding of the ancient world. It would give birth to the modern discipline of Egyptology. The Rosetta Stone was found during this expedition, found by French soldiers digging a fortification recognized by scholars in Napoleon's commission as potentially significant and eventually decoded, not by the French but by Champollion, years later to become the key to understanding the entire written tradition of ancient Egypt. Napoleon brought the library of the ancient world back to life as a byproduct of a military campaign. There is something almost absurd about this. A man leads a military expedition into Egypt, and what comes out of it? What persists? Long after the military campaign has been largely forgotten or dismissed as a failure, is the recovery of one of the most important lost languages in human history. This is the pattern of Napoleon's life. The reach always exceeds the stated target. He goes to conquer, and he also creates. He goes to win, and he also discovers, not as a side effect, not accidentally, but because at some level conquest alone was never what he was actually after. What he was after was something harder to name, something that conquest approached but never quite captured. Let me be precise about the military outcome, because honesty requires it. The Egyptian expedition as a military operation was a disaster. Napoleon won the land battles. The Battle of the Pyramids is justly famous, a display of tactical flexibility against the Mamluk cavalry, but Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding the entire expedition. The campaign in Syria failed when Napoleon couldn't take Acre. Disease, principally plague and dysentery, killed thousands of his men. The political situation in France deteriorated, and Napoleon eventually left Egypt without his army, sailing secretly back to France to participate in the coup that would make him first consul. He left his army behind. This is something that his admirers prefer to handle quickly, and his critics prefer to dwell on. The reality is somewhere in the complex middle. His departure was not cowardice. Napoleon's physical courage was, throughout his life, beyond question. He walked into musket fire. He was personally present in some of the most dangerous moments of his campaigns. He was wounded several times. No one who was actually there, who watched him in battle, ever questioned his courage in that register, but he left his men in Egypt. He left them to a campaign that could no longer succeed under the command of generals he knew to be competent. He justified this to himself as strategic necessity. France needed him more than the Egyptian expedition did, and he may have been right. The coup of Brumaire, which he executed weeks after arriving back in Paris, was the pivotal moment that transformed France from a failing republic into something new. If he had stayed in Egypt, someone else might have seized that moment. The entire trajectory of French and European history might have been different, and yet the men he left behind, who spent 2 more years in a country that was killing them with heat and disease and Ottoman military resistance, who finally surrendered and were repatriated. Some of them broken in ways that didn't heal. Those men knew what he had done. Most of them forgave him, or at least most of them never publicly said they didn't. The cult of Napoleon was powerful enough, and the conditions of the time sufficiently brutal for everyone. That personal betrayal could be absorbed into a larger narrative of shared sacrifice. But Napoleon knew what he had done. He knew it in the private register that powerful people tend to keep carefully sealed from their public presentations of self. There is a question embedded in the Egyptian expedition that I don't think has a comfortable answer. At what point does the scale of a man's vision begin to generate as a necessary byproduct? A kind of moral permission slip for actions that in a smaller life would simply be called abandonment? Napoleon had a vision of himself, of France, of what was historically possible, that was genuinely extraordinary. It was not a delusion. The events that followed proved it was at least partially achievable. But visions of that scale require sacrifices. And the person doing the sacrificing is rarely the person with the vision. The soldiers he left in Egypt did not share his vision of French imperium. They had been promised something more local and immediate, victory maybe, or at least survival, and eventually home. He gave them 2 years more of hell, and then the right to say they had served the Republic. Have you ever known someone whose vision was so large that it seemed to justify everything? Whose certainty about the importance of what they were doing appeared to grant them a kind of exemption from the ordinary obligations of care? It is a particular kind of charisma, this quality, and it is almost impossible to be close to without being both inspired and, eventually, a little devastated. Napoleon inspired an extraordinary degree of personal loyalty. His marshals, Ney, Massena, Davout, Murat, Lannes, Soult, were men of genuine military talent who had options, who could have served other masters or no master at all. They chose him, repeatedly, even when they understood that his campaigns were becoming more expensive and less likely to succeed. Even Ney, who eventually went over to the Bourbons during the first abdication, came back to him during the 100 Days. Knowing what the odds were. Why? What was it in him that produced that quality of loyalty? Part of it was material. Napoleon paid well, promoted on merit, gave his best commanders the kind of operational freedom and trust that most generals of the era refused. He treated his marshals, when things were going well, as genuine collaborators in a shared project. But that's not the whole answer. The whole answer is harder to articulate. It has to do with the experience of being seen, of being, for the duration of your encounter with him, the center of his complete and undivided attention. Soldiers in his army who met him, however briefly, reported for the rest of their lives the intensity of that attention, the sense that he was in those moments entirely present with you, that your situation, your name, your specific history, your specific problem, was for those moments the most important thing in the world to him. This was not performance. Or it was performance, but the kind of performance that is inseparable from genuine feeling, the kind of thing that is both real and calculated simultaneously, and where the calculation does not negate the reality. He cared about people the way a very good chess player cares about pieces, with genuine appreciation of their particular qualities, genuine respect for what they could do, genuine regret when they were lost. And that quality of caring, even in its instrumental form, was experienced by the people receiving it as something more personal than it perhaps was. The flame, again. Standing close to it felt like warmth, like genuine warmth, and it was warm. But it was also a flame, and it burned what it burned. There is a man I want to introduce here, because he will recur. Jean Lannes, Marshal of France, one of Napoleon's most gifted field commanders, and, perhaps, the person who came closest to genuinely knowing him. Lannes was blunt in a way that Napoleon tolerated from almost no one else. He argued with him. He told him when he thought he was wrong. He was, by multiple accounts, one of the very few people in Napoleon's entire life who could say something true to him and not be punished for it. Napoleon called him his best friend. Whether Napoleon was capable of friendship in the ordinary sense is a question we will return to. But Lannes was as close as anyone got. Lannes died at Aspern-Essling in 1809, struck by a cannonball that shattered his legs. They amputated both legs. He survived the surgery, briefly. Napoleon sat with him. There are accounts, disputed in the details, but consistent in their essential character, that describe Napoleon leaving the sick room and being seen, by his aides, weeping. Not performing grief, actually weeping. Lannes died a few days later. Napoleon continued the campaign. He won at Wagram 2 months after Aspern-Essling. He kept moving. But people who were with him in the period following Lannes's death noted something. A change, a small but definite shift in the quality of his presence, as if one of the ropes holding him to the ordinary human world had been cut. As if the person who had been for one man at least genuinely a friend, as opposed to a commander, a colleague, a patron, an admirer, had died. And with him died something in Napoleon that he had no surplus of. The fire kept burning, but one of the things that feeds a fire is connection to the ground, to something rooted, and the roots, one by one, were being cut. There is a letter, written from the Italian campaign, 1796. Napoleon had been married to Joséphine de Beauharnais for a matter of weeks before he left to take command of the army of Italy. The letter is addressed to her. It reads in part with a kind of raw, nearly grammatically collapsed intensity, "I have received all your letters, but none has made such an impression on me as the last one. Do you have any idea, darling, what you do to me? My soul and my heart are inflamed. I cannot breathe. I am dying." He was 26 years old. He had just won his first major victories in Italy. He was, for the first time in his life, being treated by the world as the person he had always believed himself to be. And in the middle of all that, in the midst of the campaign that would make him famous, that would validate every private conviction he had carried since childhood, he was writing letters to a woman who was not by all accounts writing back with equivalent urgency. Joséphine de Beauharnais was 32 when she married Napoleon, a widow with 2 children, a woman of the old aristocracy who had survived the terror, including a period of imprisonment during which she had watched her first husband be taken to the guillotine with a particular kind of steely, slightly remote grace. She was not in love with Napoleon. Not at first. She agreed to the marriage for practical reasons. He was rising. She needed security. The match made sense. And yet she is one of the most consequential people in his life. Not because of anything she did in a political or military sense, but because of what she represented in his psychology, and what the relationship with her revealed about the structure of his emotional world. Napoleon's letters to Joséphine during the Italian campaign are, by any measure, among the most remarkable love letters in European history. Not because they are beautifully written, they are not, particularly. The syntax is often broken, the grammar occasionally wrong, the emotional pitch so high and so unmodulated that reading them can be almost uncomfortable. They are remarkable because of what they reveal. A man who had essentially perfect control over every domain of his public life, who had transformed that control into an art form, writing with absolutely no control whatsoever the moment he turned to face the person he loved. The containment was total in every direction except one, and in that one direction it was absolute exposure. This asymmetry between his power over every external thing and his helplessness in the face of this particular emotional experience is fascinating. It is also, in ways that he would not have chosen, revealing, because what Joséphine's relative coolness did to him, the way her intermittent presence and ambiguity of feeling kept him in a state of perpetual longing, mirrors something in his psychological structure that the shape of his ambition also reflects. Napoleon was a man who was constitutively oriented toward the not yet achieved, toward the gap between what exists and what is possible. This is what made him extraordinary as a leader, a strategist, a builder of institutions. But it also meant that contentment, the simple satisfaction of having what you have, of being where you are, was structurally unavailable to him. The moment a thing was achieved, it became, in some sense, less interesting. The campaign that was completed became less vivid than the campaign being planned. The law that was passed became less engaging than the law being drafted. Joséphine, in her magnificent ambiguity and intermittence, was, without knowing it, almost certainly without intending it, perfectly calibrated to sustain Napoleon's desire. She was always slightly out of reach, always slightly elsewhere. Even when she was physically present, there was a quality of withheld completion about her, a sense that the full arrival of what he wanted was perpetually deferred. He could not conquer her in the way he conquered everything else. He could not resolve her with the instruments of will that resolved everything else. And that unresolvability was, paradoxically, what sustained his feeling for her. When she finally did fall fully into the relationship, when after the early years in which she was partly distracted by other lovers, she settled into genuine attachment to Napoleon, his feeling for her while it remained changed character slightly. It became less febrile, less agonized, more stable, and stability, for Napoleon's psyche, meant less interesting. This is not a cynical reading. I am not saying he stopped loving her. He clearly did not. The evidence of his feeling for Joséphine is continuous throughout his life, including on Saint Helena, where in his last years he would return to her memory repeatedly, would describe their time together as the happiest period of his life. He divorced her in 1809 for political reasons, the need for a dynastic heir that she had been unable to provide, and that divorce, which was presented publicly as a rational political decision, cost him something he never recovered. But the structure of the relationship, the way longing organized his feeling, the way completion slightly diminished intensity, this tells us something important about his inner life, something that the military campaigns also tell us, but in a different register. Napoleon was a man who lived in the future, not in a neurotic escape from the present way. He was also intensely present, more present than almost anyone his contemporaries described. But the orientation of his energy was always forward, always toward what was not yet, always organized around a horizon that moved as he moved. This is a particular kind of consciousness, a particular way of being in time, and it is, in some ways, extraordinarily generative. It is the consciousness of the builder, the creator, the revolutionary, the person who makes the world different because they cannot stop reaching toward a different version of it. But it comes with a cost. The cost is that the present, the actual present, the present where the people who love you live and breathe and need things from you, that present is always slightly dim compared to the bright light of the not yet. His children felt this. His wives felt this. His brothers and sisters, whom he elevated to thrones across Europe, who owed their kingdoms to him, felt this too. Being in Napoleon's orbit meant being in the orbit of a man whose attention was the most extraordinary attention you had ever experienced, and also a man whose attention was always, on some level, partially elsewhere. Partially in the campaign not yet fought, the law not yet written, the empire not yet consolidated. The people he loved bore the cost of his greatness. They bore it willingly, for the most part, because the alternative, a lesser Napoleon, a Napoleon with more even emotional availability and less of everything else, was not actually available. The Napoleon they knew, the Napoleon they were with, was not separable from his restlessness. Take away the restlessness and you don't get a more present, warmer person. You get no one. You get an ordinary man, which he was not and could not be. Have you ever loved someone whose greatness was inseparable from the thing in them that hurt you most? After Joséphine, he married Marie-Louise of Austria. She was 18, a Habsburg archduchess, chosen for reasons of dynastic politics. The alliance with Austria, the production of an heir. She was not Joséphine. She was pleasant, dutiful, pleasant again. She gave him his son, the King of Rome, who would become Napoleon II in name only, who would die young in Vienna without ever seeing France as an adult, who is one of history's great poignant footnotes. Napoleon loved his son with a specific tender quality that is touching to read about, and also a little heartbreaking because it was so clearly also a projection, not just love for a child, but love for a future version of the project, love for the dynasty that would carry the name and the work forward, love for the resolution of the question he had been asking since he was a boy sitting alone at Brienne, reading about men who had made themselves into myths. He would never see his son again after the abdication of 1814. That loss, too, is something he carried to Saint Helena without ever processing in any public way. The journals from his exile contain references to the King of Rome that are careful, controlled, and through the control, devastating. There is a kind of grief that very powerful people carry in a specific way, because their power, which has organized everything else in their lives, has no purchase on grief. Grief doesn't respond to will. Grief doesn't respond to command. You cannot outmaneuver it, or flank it, or find a position from which it becomes manageable. It simply sits there, immovable, impervious to the instruments that have worked on everything else. The fire meets the one thing it cannot burn. Napoleon spent much of the last 6 years of his life on Saint Helena, in the presence of that fire and that unmovable thing. We will arrive there. But first there is still so much to cover. The height of the empire, the Russian campaign, the psychology of catastrophe. First, though, before we get to what could not be conquered, we should understand what was. There is a fact about Napoleon that tends to be buried under the glamour of the military campaigns and the tragedy of the final exile. A fact that is in some ways more radical and more durable than anything he accomplished on a battlefield. Most of you right now, living in Europe or in a country that was shaped by European legal tradition, are living under a system that Napoleon built, not metaphorically, literally. The legal codes that govern property rights, contractual obligations, civil marriage, divorce, the relationship between citizens and the state. These codes, in most of continental Europe and in many former European colonies from Quebec to Louisiana to Algeria to Vietnam, are either the Napoleonic Code itself or direct descendants of it. When you sign a lease, when you inherit property, when you exercise rights as a citizen that exist independently of your birth status or the preferences of whoever currently holds power, you are in that moment, standing in an edifice that Napoleon's mind helped construct. This is worth sitting with, because it means that the reach of Napoleon's influence on your life is not mediated by historical interest. It is direct, structural, invisible, the way the truly fundamental things are always invisible, because they have become too basic to notice. How did this happen? To answer that, you have to understand what France actually was before the Revolution and before Napoleon. The legal structure of pre-revolutionary France was a chaotic accumulation of centuries of contradictory legislation, regional custom, feudal obligation, ecclesiastical law, royal decree, and local practice. There was no unified law. A contractual arrangement that was enforceable in Paris might be void in Lyon. Rights that existed in one province were non-existent in the next. The justice system was opaque, dependent on birth and connection, wildly inconsistent in its outcomes. The revolution had destroyed this structure, or tried to. But destruction is easier than construction. The years between 1789 and 1799 had produced enormous quantities of new legislation, much of it contradictory, and had failed to produce any coherent framework. The legal situation in France at the time of Napoleon's coup was actually in some respects worse than it had been under the Ancien Régime. At least the old system had the coherence of tradition. Napoleon appointed a commission of 4 great jurists. He gave them a deadline. He attended many of the drafting sessions himself. An extraordinary thing for a head of state to do, a detail that reveals something important. He did not delegate the things that mattered. He was present. He argued. He pushed back on legal reasoning that seemed to him artificial or impractical. The commission produced the Civil Code in 1804. It was a document of approximately 2,200 articles. It established with radical clarity the principles that would define civil society in the modern sense. Equality before the law, meaning that your legal rights did not depend on your birth status, your religion, or your inherited rank. Freedom of religion, meaning the state could not compel religious conformity. The inviolability of private property, meaning that the state could not arbitrarily seize what you had legitimately acquired. A framework for civil marriage and divorce that treated marriage as a contract between individuals rather than a sacrament administered by the Church. These principles were not entirely new. The Revolution had articulated many of them. But articulating a principle and encoding it in a functional legal system are entirely different operations. Napoleon encoded them. He gave them teeth. He created the institutional machinery, the courts, the prefectures, the trained administrators, that would make them operative in daily life, rather than remaining philosophical declarations. He also had significant limitations in the code, and honesty requires acknowledging them. The code took a deeply conservative position on the rights of women within marriage, returning to principles of marital authority that the Revolution had briefly modified, restoring the husband's legal control over his wife's property and movements in ways that would not be substantially reformed until the 20th century. This was not incidental or accidental. Napoleon's views on women were regressive, even by the standards of his contemporaries. He said things, in conversations that were recorded by multiple witnesses, that make clear he viewed women's primary function as reproductive and domestic, and he shaped the code accordingly. This is the crack in the great edifice. The code that established equality before the law for men, that eliminated aristocratic privilege and religious discrimination, that made the Enlightenment operative, this same code inscribed inequality along a different axis. It is a contradiction that runs through the entire Napoleonic project, and we should look at it directly rather than around it. Napoleon was a man of the Enlightenment in the domain of rational governance, law, and the organization of state power. He had absorbed from his reading and from the world the Revolution had made the fundamental Enlightenment conviction that human beings, as rational agents capable of self-governance, deserved equal standing before the law. He believed this with apparent sincerity. But he was not a man of the Enlightenment in the domain of actual equality. His empire was hierarchical in ways that reflected both his own hunger for structure and his fundamental, and in this respect entirely conventional assumption that the family and society required vertical organization with men at the top. How do you hold that contradiction? How do you understand a figure who was simultaneously one of the great architects of legal modernity and a man whose views on half the human race were, by any fair measure, a step backward? You hold it the same way you hold all the great contradictions of great historical figures, carefully, without collapsing the tension in either direction, neither dismissing the achievement because of the failure, nor pretending the failure away because of the achievement. Both things are true. Both things matter. The world he built contains both his brilliance and his blindness, and the world we live in contains both as well. His educational reforms were similarly transformative and similarly mixed. He created the lycée system, the state-funded secondary schools that educated a generation of French administrators, scientists, military officers. He created the grandes écoles, the elite institutions of higher education that still exist and still shape French intellectual and professional life. He made education, at least for boys, a state priority rather than a privilege of birth or wealth. He also created the Légion d'honneur, the system of merit-based recognition that replaced the old aristocratic orders. The idea was simple and radical. If the Revolution had abolished hereditary nobility, there still needed to be some way to recognize extraordinary service and achievement. The Légion d'honneur was the Enlightenment answer to that need, honor earned rather than inherited, performance recognized rather than bloodline rewarded. 30 million people alive today hold the Légion d'honneur. Scientists and artists and athletes and first responders. The most diverse set of human achievement recognizable in a single symbol. Napoleon created that symbol and the institution behind it. He created the modern university examination system, in which advancement is based on demonstrated knowledge rather than social connection. He created the system of weights and measures that became the metric system, now the standard across most of the world. He created the first modern census in France. He established the first network of roads specifically designed for military and commercial efficiency, roads that the armies of Europe had used for 2 centuries before the railway era transformed them. The breadth of this, the sheer variety of domains in which he left a permanent mark, is almost impossible to process as the work of one person, one consciousness, one organizing intelligence. It is the work of a civilization, except it happened in 15 years, under one man's direction. Here is the thing that struck me most, reading through the scholarship on Napoleon's administrative legacy. The speed. Not just the speed of his military campaigns, which is well known. The speed of his legislative and institutional work. The civil code, drafted and enacted in the time that it typically takes a parliamentary committee to produce a position paper. The reorganization of the French educational system, conceived and implemented while simultaneously managing the military and diplomatic demands of an empire at continuous war. This speed was not recklessness. The code was not carelessly made. Its provisions have proven durable across centuries and multiple revisions, which is the ultimate proof of quality in legal drafting. The educational institutions he founded are still operating. The speed was the product of that architecture of will we discussed earlier, a mind that did not lose energy in the ordinary friction of self-doubt, of institutional inertia, of the social cost of moving faster than the people around you expected. But there is also something else in that speed. Something slightly frightening, if you think about it. A man who could move that fast, across that many domains, was also a man who could not wait, could not allow the ordinary deliberative processes, the consultation, the iteration, the incorporation of feedback from people affected by the decisions, to run at their natural pace. He had a solution, he had a timeline, he had a vision of the end state, and the ordinary human time required to build genuine consensus was time he did not have and was not willing to give. The result was that the Napoleonic transformation of France and Europe was, to a remarkable degree, imposed. Not in the purely coercive sense. Most of the things he created were genuinely popular, at least initially. People wanted the code. People wanted the roads. People wanted the rational administration after decades of chaos. But they didn't fully choose them. They received them. There is a difference, and that difference matters in ways that became visible later, when Napoleon's empire began to encounter genuine resistance. Because when things that have been imposed begin to fail, or when the person imposing them is no longer powerful enough to enforce them, the question of whether the people subject to those things genuinely believe in them, have made them their own, have internalized them as expressions of their own values, rather than accommodations to superior power, becomes suddenly urgent. Napoleon found this out in Spain, and then in Russia, and then definitively in the long catastrophic unraveling that followed. But the code survived him. The educational institutions survived him. The roads, the weights and measures, the legal framework of the modern European state, these survived. Which means that what he built, even if it was imposed in the moment, was adopted, internalized, made genuinely one's own by the generations that followed, who experienced not the imposition but the inheritance. That is the nature of durable creation. It doesn't matter how it began, it matters what it becomes in the hands of the people who receive it. And Napoleon, who could not impose his will on time or on grief or on the limits of his own physical endurance, imposed his will on the future in a way that has, so far, proven largely irreversible. The fire burned, and some of what it burned became light that outlasted the fire itself. Let's talk about the height. We have circled it long enough. The famous short Napoleon, the little corporal, the diminutive tyrant elevated by military genius above his natural station, is one of the most persistent and fascinating examples of deliberate historical distortion in the modern era. It is, to a remarkable degree, a fabrication, and the story of how that fabrication came to be is itself a kind of masterclass in the mechanics of propaganda, perception, and the specific vulnerability of powerful people to a particular kind of attack. Napoleon was approximately 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall by modern measurement, roughly 168 to 170 meters. This was average for a Frenchman of his era, and in some assessments slightly above average. He was not tall, but he was not short. The confusion arose partly from a genuine measurement discrepancy. French inches and English inches were not the same unit, and early English translations of his height in French units produced a figure that read as dramatically short to an English audience that used different measurement standards. But the confusion was also cultivated. William Pitt's government, which regarded Napoleon as an existential threat to British interests, funded a sustained campaign of caricature and propaganda. Gilray, the great British caricaturist, drew Napoleon repeatedly as a tiny figure in an enormous hat, raging and strutting, the classic physical embodiment of what the English called Little Boney. These images were extraordinarily effective. They were reproduced in enormous quantities, displayed in shop windows, passed from hand to hand. They shaped the mental image of Napoleon for generations of English speakers. The nickname Little Corporal, Le Petit Caporal, was actually a term of endearment used by his own troops. It was affectionate, not mocking, referring to his willingness to be among them rather than to his height. The troops were mostly larger than he was in the early campaigns. The Imperial Guard, which is often photographed with Napoleon, were selected in part for their imposing physical stature, which made him appear shorter by comparison in surviving images. But the soldiers who called him their petit caporal were not commenting on his size. They were claiming intimacy with him. It was the nickname of belonging. The British propaganda took that nickname and inverted its meaning completely, transformed it from an expression of soldierly affection into evidence of physical inadequacy. And the transformation was so effective, so perfectly aligned with the psychological needs of people who wanted to diminish a frightening enemy, that it survived the propaganda that created it and became historical fact. This matters not just as a historical footnote about Napoleon's actual height. It matters because it illustrates something profound about the relationship between power and narrative. Napoleon understood this relationship with extraordinary clarity. He understood that controlling the story was, in some domains, as important as controlling the territory. He commissioned portraits, managed his public image, created newspapers and censured others, choreographed his own mythology with the same attention to detail he brought to military campaigns. But he could not control what his enemies said about him across the Channel, or what the years of sustained propaganda were doing to the image of him that would eventually become the default historical image. The man who was a master of his own narrative was undone, posthumously, by someone else's narrative, which is perhaps the most Napoleonic possible fate, to be defeated by the instrument you used most effectively, wielded by someone else. His actual physical presence, by the accounts of people who encountered him, was extraordinary in ways that had nothing to do with height. The eyes are described by almost every contemporary who met him, allies, enemies, neutral observers, in terms of unusual intensity. Vivid, penetrating, the kind of eyes that made you feel seen in a way that was at once flattering and slightly alarming. Metternich, the Austrian chancellor who negotiated with Napoleon across a decade of complex diplomacy, and who was emphatically not an admirer, wrote in his memoirs that Napoleon's gaze was the most remarkable thing about him, that even in situations where Metternich had prepared carefully and was operating from a position of some advantage, those eyes made him feel as if he were the one who was being read. There are dozens of similar accounts, from men and women, from admirers and opponents, from people meeting him for the first time and people who had known him for years. The experience of Napoleon's presence seems to have been singular in a specific way. He was more there than other people. More there in the sense of more fully occupying the space, more completely attending to what was actually happening, more thoroughly present in his own body and attention. This quality, call it presence or charisma or whatever term you prefer, is deeply connected to something we discussed earlier, the separation of self-doubt from operational functioning. When you are not spending a significant portion of your available attention on managing your internal uncertainty, you have more attention for the external world. You are more present because the ordinary drain of self-consciousness is minimized. Napoleon's presence was the external expression of his internal architecture. The same structure that made him able to dictate multiple letters simultaneously to absorb battlefield information at inhuman speed, to project calm in the middle of chaos, that structure showed in his face, in his bearing, in the quality of his attention when he looked at you. And people responded to it with an intensity that sometimes surprised even them. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, but representative in its emotional logic, about a meeting between Napoleon and Goethe in 1808 at Erfurt, the meeting of the two most famous living Europeans. Goethe, who had spent his life studying the nature of genius, who had written Faust, who had lived more fully inside the question of what extraordinary human beings are and what they cost, Goethe met Napoleon and was, by his own admission, shaken. He said afterward, with characteristic precision, "There I saw a man. Not I met a great man, or I met a powerful man. I saw a man," as if the category itself required emphasis, as if what he had encountered was the word human inflected to its maximum possible intensity. That description haunts me. What does it mean to see a man so completely that the observation requires that emphasis? What level of presence, what density of being, produces that effect in a witness of Goethe's depth and perception? I think it means this. Napoleon was in the particular moments when he was fully switched on, fully attending, fully present in the way he was capable of being present, the most fully realized example of a specific human possibility. The possibility of agency, of will in action, of human consciousness deliberately shaping reality rather than being shaped by it, and Goethe, who had spent his intellectual life in the presence of that possibility as a philosophical and aesthetic question, suddenly found himself in its physical presence. Saw it with his eyes, felt it. There I saw a man. But here is the complication. Here is where the image begins to crack, as all images do when you look at them long enough and carefully enough. The Napoleon that Goethe saw, that presence, that density, that maximum human agency, was also performing. Not insincerely, but performatively. Napoleon was always, to some degree, building the monument to himself in real time. The portraits he commissioned, the bulletins he wrote describing his own battles, the careful management of the historical record, these were not vanity alone. They were the expression of a man who understood, earlier and more clearly than anyone of his era, that power in the modern world is partly a function of narrative, that what people believe about you matters as much as what you have actually done, that the monument, if you don't build it yourself, will be built by your enemies, and it will not be flattering. So Napoleon performed Napoleon. He performed it brilliantly, with a consistency and a coherence that makes it impossible to separate the performance from the person. The man who performed being Napoleon was Napoleon. There is no unperformed self available for comparison, and yet there are moments in the Egyptian desert, in the sick room with Lanz, in the letters to Joséphine with their broken grammar and their abandoned dignity, when the performance stops, when the frame around the image falls away, and what you see in those moments is not a different Napoleon, exactly, but a simpler one, a man who is tired and does not know it, or knows it and cannot let himself stop. A man who has made himself into the most extraordinary figure of his age and who must now, every day, remain equal to that figure. The weight of that. The ongoing, daily, never-completed work of remaining Napoleon, of not being the man who flinched, or hesitated, or showed a face that the legend could not accommodate. There is a line from his private journals written sometime in 1813, when the catastrophe of Russia was already behind him, and the coalition forming against him was already larger than he could realistically fight. There are days when I do not recognize myself. I look for the man I was, and I find only the man the world has made. I don't know if that line is exactly right. The provenance of Napoleon's private journals is complicated by decades of editorial intervention. But its emotional truth, its fit with everything else we know about his inner life in that period, makes it feel real. Makes it feel like something he could have written, something he might have been thinking. The man who made himself, who remade the world, who became, through an act of pure, sustained will, the most powerful individual of his era, looking in the mirror, finding a monument where a man used to be. Russia, 1812. The number that historians have most often used to describe the Grande Armée that crossed the Niemen River into Russia in June of that year is 600,000. 600,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled in Europe up to that point. An army drawn from France, from the satellite kingdoms of Germany and Italy and the Netherlands and Spain, from the Duchy of Warsaw, from the Confederation of the Rhine, an army that contained among its soldiers men who spoke French, German, Italian, Polish, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, and a dozen other languages. An army that stretched, at its full extent of march, for more than 400 kilometers along the roads of western Russia. They crossed the Niemen in June. The weather was hot. Too hot for men in the heavy uniforms of the Napoleonic army, carrying the weight of their equipment and their rations, marching in columns along roads that turned to deep dust under so many feet. The horses began to die early. The fodder was inadequate, the heat was brutal, and the Russian cavalry, executing what would become the defining strategy of the entire campaign, kept retreating without engaging in the pitched battle that would have given the French the decisive victory they needed. The Russians burned their own crops and their own villages as they retreated. They were scorching the earth, removing everything that an advancing army could use, pulling the French deeper into a country that was increasingly empty of everything that could sustain them. Napoleon had expected a battle on the frontier. Then a battle at Smolensk, then, surely, a battle before Moscow. The Russians kept retreating. Smolensk burned. Moscow was abandoned and set alight by the Russians themselves before the French arrived. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14, 1812, at the head of an army of perhaps 100,000. 600,000 had become 100,000 in the course of a march through disease, desertion, combat, and the simple attrition of marching in terrible conditions through an empty, burning country. He occupied Moscow for 35 days. He waited for the Tsar to negotiate. The Tsar did not negotiate. Napoleon sent letters. They went unanswered. He walked through the empty palaces of the Kremlin, through streets that were still burning in places, and he waited. What did he do during those 35 days? He dictated letters. He worked on legislation. He reorganized the Comédie Française in Paris. He sent dispatches about the administration of French municipalities. He did the things he always did, the things that had worked in every other context. The forward motion, the work, the refusal to stop, and none of it helped. Because the thing he needed was not something he could produce through effort. He needed the Tsar to negotiate, and the Tsar had decided, for reasons that had as much to do with Russian pride and Russian geography as with military calculation, not to negotiate. Napoleon was waiting for someone to respond to him in the way that his opponents had always responded, with capitulation or with battle. With the ordinary logic of European warfare, which assumed that when you captured the enemy's capital, you had won, and that winning produced negotiation, and negotiation produced peace. That logic did not apply here. Russia was too large, and the Tsar's calculus was too different, and the autumn was already turning cold. He left Moscow on October 19th. He had waited too long. He had wanted to believe for 5 weeks that the logic he understood would eventually reassert itself, that Tsar Alexander would remember what European conventions demanded of a defeated power. Alexander had no intention of being a defeated power. The fire of Moscow was his answer to Napoleon's conventions. The retreat began. What happened during the retreat from Moscow is one of the most documented and most terrible episodes in modern European history. The cold came early that year. Not the brutally early cold of legend, the fantastical Russian winter that sometimes gets invoked as if it were supernatural rather than meteorological, but earlier than the French had planned for, and the army was completely unprepared. The summer uniforms, the inadequate rations, the horses dying in their thousands, the roads choked with the debris of an army dissolving, the Cossacks harassing the columns day and night, the bridges destroyed by Russian forces before the French could cross. At the crossing of the Berezina River in late November, with Russian forces converging on 3 sides, and the river flooded and half-frozen, Napoleon's engineers built bridges in temperatures far below freezing, working in the water, most of them dying of hypothermia before the crossing was complete. The army crossed over their bodies. By December, when the remnants reached the Niemen and crossed back into what was effectively friendly territory, the Grande Armée had ceased to exist. The estimates vary in the scholarship, but somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 men had died. In battle, of disease, of cold, of starvation. Horses, artillery, the accumulated material of the greatest military force the world had seen, all of it was gone, left in the snow of Russia. Napoleon left the army in Poland in December, transferring command to Murat, and returned to Paris by sleigh, a journey of extraordinary speed covering thousands of kilometers in less than 2 weeks, traveling incognito through areas where his presence would have been dangerous. He arrived in Paris and announced, essentially without acknowledging the scale of what had happened, that he was raising a new army and that the campaign would continue. The army he raised 300,000 conscripts, many of them teenagers pressed into service in months rather than years, would fight the German campaign of 1813, would win several battles, including Lutzen and Bautzen, would lose at Leipzig the Battle of the Nations in October 1813, in a battle that lasted 4 days and involved over 500,000 soldiers from more than a dozen nations, the largest battle in European history up to that point, and for a century afterward, would retreat back into France. And then there would be the campaign of France itself, 1814, brilliant and desperate, and ultimately insufficient, Napoleon commanding a fraction of the forces arrayed against him and winning engagements by the quality of his improvisation that were, in strictly military terms, some of his finest work, but winning battles that did not add up to winning the war. The coalition took Paris on March 30th, 1814. Napoleon abdicated on April 6th. He had been in power for 15 years. He had remade France, reshaped Europe, left his mark on institutions that would outlast him by centuries. He had fought more than 60 battles and won the great majority of them. He had, by any measure, achieved more in 15 years than most nations achieve in centuries. And now it was over. What do you do with that? What does a consciousness like Napoleon's, a consciousness organized entirely around forward motion around the gap between what exists and what is possible, around the project of closing that gap through the sustained application of extraordinary will, what does that consciousness do when it reaches the wall? when the forward motion is forcibly stopped, when the project is not incomplete but terminated. The first abdication in April 1814 produced something that his closest observers found deeply strange. Napoleon was, in those days, not the devastated figure one might expect. He was not calm either. There were accounts of extreme agitation, of pacing, of sudden strange silences. There were persistent rumors, which some historians take seriously and some dismiss, of a suicide attempt, using a poison he had carried for years against the possibility of capture. Whether or not that is literally true, the emotional reality it points to seems real. A man confronting for the first time the experience of being not the agent of history, but its subject, of being the thing that happens to rather than the thing that makes things happen. He was sent to Elba, a small island off the coast of Tuscany. He was given sovereignty over it, the title of emperor reduced to sovereignty over an island of 12,000 people, and an annual income from France, and his imperial guard reduced to a few hundred men, and his family connections mostly severed, and the attention of every major power in Europe at least partly directed elsewhere toward the negotiation of a new European order at the Congress of Vienna. He spent 10 months on Elba. He governed it with genuine seriousness. He built roads, he improved the mines, he reformed the agriculture, he paid personal attention to the details of the island's administration in ways that were, for a place that size, absurdly detailed. As if the reforming energy that had reorganized France and reshaped Europe simply could not stop, simply had to find an outlet, even if the outlet was an island 12 kilometers across. But he was also watching, reading the newspapers that came in from the mainland, receiving visitors, paying attention to what the Congress of Vienna was deciding, to the mood in France under the restored Bourbon government, to the discontent of the French army, the marshals, the veterans, the men who had fought with him for 15 years, and who now found themselves in a France that was trying to pretend the revolutionary and Napoleonic period had been an aberration, a mistake, something to be smoothed over and forgotten. It was not being forgotten. France was not a place that could pretend the last 25 years had not happened. The civil code existed. The educational institutions existed. The men who had risen from nothing to command armies existed. The expectation of equal standing before the law existed. The Bourbon Restoration was trying to reinstate the Ancien regime in a country that had been fundamentally remade, and the country was resisting. Napoleon watched this, and in February 1815, he left Elba. He landed in the south of France with approximately 1,000 men. He marched north. The 5th Regiment of Line Infantry sent to stop him reached him at Laffrey, a pass in the Alps, and Napoleon walked out alone in front of his escort, opened his coat, and said, "If any of you wants to shoot his emperor, here I am." They joined him. This moment, the emperor alone in the road coat, open, offering his body to the guns of his former army, is one of those episodes that is so perfectly dramatic that it threatens to feel theatrical, scripted, too good to be true. But it happened. Multiple witnesses, multiple accounts, and what it reveals about Napoleon's understanding of the situation and of the men in front of him is characteristic. He did not try to argue with them. He did not offer reasons or explanations. He offered himself, his presence, the myth standing in the road, asking to be believed, and they believed, and they followed, and within 3 weeks, without a single battle, Napoleon had reclaimed France. He would have precisely 100 days. The 100 days are, in the scholarship, both extensively studied and fundamentally strange. They have the quality of a dream. The structure of the familiar made slightly wrong, slightly off, as if the dreamer knows at some level that what they are experiencing cannot be sustained, that the waking world will return, but cannot stop dreaming anyway. Napoleon returned to Paris on March 20, 1815. He reformed his government. He issued the Additional Act, a constitutional document that was more liberal than anything he had produced at the height of his power, acknowledging the Chamber of Deputies limiting executive authority, attempting to present himself as a reformed emperor of a constitutional France. The critics called it inadequate. The supporters called it a beginning. Napoleon called it practical necessity and continued preparing for war, because war was coming. There was never any question of that. The Allied powers at Vienna had declared him an outlaw, not just an enemy, but a man who had placed himself outside the pale of civil and social relations. This was not a diplomatic formality. It was a statement of intent. The combined forces of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were moving. The question was not whether they would fight, but where. Napoleon chose to move first. In June, he took approximately 120,000 men into Belgium, intending to defeat the Prussian army under Blücher and the British-led coalition army under Wellington before they could combine. The concept was Napoleonic in its classical form: divide the enemy, defeat them in detail, move faster than they could coordinate. It almost worked. At Ligny on June 16th, he defeated Blücher and the Prussians, inflicting serious casualties. At Quatre Bras on the same day, his left wing under Ney failed to take the road junction that would have split the Allied forces, a failure of coordination of execution, of something that in 1805 would not have happened. The instrument was not what it had been. The marshals were tired or cautious or simply less capable than their predecessors. Lannes was dead. Bessières was dead. The generation of men who had fought beside him from Italy through Austerlitz was gone or broken. He met Wellington at Waterloo on June 18th. I want to be careful here, because the scholarship on Waterloo is enormous and contentious, and I don't want to reduce it to the kind of post hoc narrative that feels inevitable in retrospect, but distorts what was actually happening on that day. Waterloo was not a certainty. It was not the inevitable punishment of hubris, the inevitable defeat of a man who had overreached. It was a battle that could have gone differently, and the question of why it didn't is worth taking seriously. Napoleon delayed his attack until late morning, waiting for the ground to dry. Heavy rain the previous night had made artillery deployment difficult. This delay has been analyzed endlessly. Some historians argue it was a mistake that gave the Prussians, retreating from Ligny, time to regroup and march to Wellington's relief. Others argue the delay was operationally necessary and that the real problem was Ney's failure to take La Haye-Sainte early enough, or Grouchy's failure to prevent the Prussians from arriving, or the failure of the Imperial Guard's final assault to break the British line. What is clear is this: by late afternoon, the Allied line was still holding. The Prussians were arriving on Napoleon's right flank. He committed the Imperial Guard, the old guard, the veterans of 100 campaigns, the elite corps that had never broken, never retreated, in a final assault on the British center. The Guard advanced up the slope at Waterloo. They had always advanced. They had never been turned back, and they were met, this time, by a volley from the British infantry, and then by a sudden flanking attack from the Guards brigade that appeared from behind a ridge, and they stopped. For the first time in their history, the old Guard stopped. And then, and this is the moment that unraveled everything, the moment that spread through the battlefield with the speed of panic, the word went through the French army that the Guard was retreating. La Garde recule. The Guard is retreating. It was over. Not because the military situation was beyond recovery. Necessarily, Napoleon's staff believed even in those minutes that a reorganization was possible, that a defensive withdrawal could be ordered and the army could fight another day. But the psychological reality was more decisive than the military one. The thing that had seemed impossible was happening. The anchor of the French military identity, the proof of Napoleon's invincibility, was moving backward, and with that proof gone, everything else went too. Napoleon was swept back with the rout. He had, in the last minutes before the collapse, attempted to rally the Guard, standing in the road, offering himself again as he had offered himself at Laffrey, an act of physical courage in the middle of catastrophe. It didn't work this time. The tide was running the wrong way, and it swept past him. He reached Paris. He briefly considered continuing the resistance. There were still armies in the field. There were options. There were people who would fight. He was talked out of it, or persuaded himself, or simply ran out of the one thing he had never run out of before, the conviction that the next move would be sufficient, that there was a next move. He abdicated for the second and final time on June 22, 1815. He wrote a proclamation. It contained the phrase, "I sacrifice myself for the liberty, peace, and welfare of France." Whether he believed this, or whether it was the last performance of the myth, or whether there is even a meaningful difference between those two things when speaking of Napoleon, I genuinely don't know. He surrendered to the British warship Bellerophon on July 15th. He had hoped to be allowed to live in England or in America. The British sent him to Saint Helena. There is a particular quality of sadness in reading about Napoleon's last days on the Bellerophon, before he knew definitively where he was being sent. He walked the decks. He talked to the officers and sailors who found him almost universally not what they had expected. Not the monster of the caricatures, not the violent egoist, but a man of charm and intelligence and unexpected warmth. A man who asked questions and remembered answers and laughed at jokes and was in ways that disarmed them completely, simply extraordinary company. The sailor who described him most vividly wrote, We had expected Boney. We found a gentleman. They sent him to Saint Helena anyway. Of course they did. He was too dangerous. The evidence of the 100 days that he could walk back into France with 1,000 men and reclaim an empire was too fresh, too alarming. They sent him to the one place that seemed to guarantee containment, a small remote island in the South Atlantic, nearly 2,000 kilometers from the nearest continental landmass. He never left it. Saint Helena, 1815 to 1821. 6 years. The island sits in the South Atlantic at roughly 15 degrees south latitude, approximately 1,800 kilometers west of the coast of Angola. It is 11 miles long and 6 miles wide. The landscape is dramatic. Steep volcanic hills, dramatic cliffs, a coastline that makes landing difficult. The weather oscillates between pleasant and damp. The British had used it as a provisioning station for ships making the journey around Africa since the 17th century. Napoleon arrived in October 1815. He was 46 years old. He would die at 51. He was housed first at the Briars, a small pavilion on the property of a local family named Balcombe, while Longwood House, a larger property that had been prepared for him, was being made ready. The Balcombe period is one of the more striking of his final years. The family had several children, and Napoleon formed a genuine friendship with the youngest, Betsy, who was 14. She was apparently completely unintimidated by him, challenged him to games, teased him, spoke to him without deference, and he responded with a warmth and playfulness that surprised everyone who witnessed it. It is an image. The most powerful man of the age, reduced to exile, finding genuine pleasure in the company of a teenage girl who wasn't afraid of him, that carries a particular kind of light. It suggests that what he craved in those years was ordinary human contact without the performance that power required. Contact with someone who had no stake in his myth, who didn't need anything from him, who interacted with him as a person rather than as an emperor or a prisoner. He had, during his years of power, very few such relationships, almost none. The myth was always present, even in his most intimate moments with Joséphine, with his son, with his closest marshals. The awareness of who he was, and of what they knew about who he was, inflected every interaction. The performance was always running, even at low volume. With Betsy Balcombe, the performance could stop. She didn't care about the performance. He moved to Longwood in December 1815. The conditions there were not comfortable, damp, cramped, with a staff that was never sufficient, and a British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, who was either genuinely hostile to Napoleon or simply following his instructions to maintain strict security and minimal communication with the outside world, depending on which account you read. Napoleon and Lowe never met without argument. Napoleon called him a clerk, a bureaucrat, a man of no imagination who had been given a task he was not equipped to understand. Lowe, for his part, was deeply suspicious of everything Napoleon said and did. Every visitor was monitored. Every letter was opened. The restrictions on Napoleon's movement were substantial. He could not leave a certain radius without a British officer escort. The confinement was absolute. For a man whose entire life had been organized around forward motion, around the translation of intention into action, around the daily exercise of power over the physical world, this confinement was something that tested the limits of the psychological architecture we described earlier. There was no outlet for the will. There was nothing to conquer. The future, which had always been Napoleon's native territory, had contracted to a small damp house on a small wet island. What he did in response was remarkable in its own way. He wrote, or rather, he dictated, his memoirs, his account of his campaigns and his reign, the narrative of his life and times, as he chose to present it, he dictated to the group of followers who had accompanied him to Saint Helena. Bertrand Gourgaud, Las Cases and Montholon. Las Cases in particular was his principal amanuensis, recording the dictations in what would become the Memorial of Saint Helena, published in 1823, 2 years after Napoleon's death, and which became one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. The memorial is a fascinating and problematic document. It is Napoleon's autobiography in the sense that it records his own account of his life and work. It is also almost certainly deliberately shaped, a piece of propaganda for his own legacy, an attempt to control the narrative in exactly the way he had always understood narrative needed to be controlled. He knew he was writing for history. He knew the memorial would be read by generations that had not lived through his era. He was building the monument he had always been building, now in words rather than in deeds, with the materials of retrospective argument rather than present action. He positioned himself in the memorial as the true heir of the revolution, as the man who had consolidated and protected the revolutionary ideals against the reaction of the old European order, as the liberal emperor who had brought rational governance and legal equality to a continent ruled by feudal privilege. This self-presentation was partial, selective, sometimes outright misleading. But it was also not entirely false. The tension between Napoleon the revolutionary and Napoleon the authoritarian is real. It runs through his whole career, and the memorial's insistence on the first at the expense of the second reflects genuine conviction alongside obvious propaganda. The image of Napoleon that dominated European radical and liberal politics throughout the 19th century, the Napoleon of Byron and Heine, the Napoleon that inspired revolutionary movements across Europe and Latin America, the Napoleon that a young Karl Marx and a young Stendhal and a young Beethoven, who had famously intended to dedicate the Eroica Symphony to Napoleon before tearing up the dedication page when Napoleon declared himself emperor. This Napoleon was largely constructed on Saint Helena. It was the Exile's version, the man who had been brought down by the kings and their reactionary coalitions, the liberal emperor, martyred by the old order. This image had enormous power. It was not entirely accurate. Napoleon's relationship to liberalism was always instrumental. He used liberal ideas when they served his purposes and suppressed them when they didn't. His press censorship was severe. His police state was effective. The opposition newspapers were closed. The political prisoners were real. But the image was built on enough truth to sustain itself, and it sustained itself for a century, shaping European nationalism, European liberalism, the entire romantic political tradition. Napoleon's ghost walked through the 19th century like one of those figures who was more powerful after death than before it. He had understood this would happen. He had, in effect, planned for it. There is a letter, or rather there is a reported statement, from the memorial in which Napoleon tells Las Casas something that has become one of his most quoted observations. My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of so many victories. But what nothing can erase, what will live forever, is my civil code. This is either prescient wisdom or retrospective rationalization, and maybe both. But it was accurate. The civil code has outlasted the memory of Austerlitz. The legal framework he built has proved more durable than the empire he conquered. The institutional legacy has outlasted the military one by generations and is still running. He knew what he had built. He knew which parts of it would last. His health deteriorated on Saint Helena. The causes of his death have been the subject of sustained historical and forensic debate. The official cause, stomach cancer, is accepted by most mainstream historians. A minority position holds that he was poisoned, probably by arsenic, either deliberately or through the ubiquitous use of arsenic-based pigments in the damp wallpaper at Longwood. Hair samples taken from Napoleon have shown elevated arsenic levels, though the interpretation of those results remains contested. He died on May 5, 1821, at approximately 5:49 in the afternoon, during a period of particularly severe weather. The accounts of his final days are consistent in describing a man who was still in the intervals between periods of incapacity, attempting to dictate, attempting to remain present, attempting to continue the project of the memorial and of his own posterity. His last words are disputed, as famous last words tend to be. One version, France, army, head of the army, Joséphine; another, simply Joséphine. He had not seen her for more than a decade. She had died in 1814 at Malmaison, shortly after his first abdication. She died while he was still in power, or barely out of it, while the scale of what was ending was still becoming clear. He had heard of her death from a distance. He had mourned it, in private, in the way he mourned everything, containing it, not performing it, keeping it in the chamber where the grief lived. And now, at the end, in the dissolution of all the careful architecture, in the final reduction to something more essential, the name that came was hers. Its acquisition, its exercise, its loss, the arc of an extraordinary career, the rise and fall, the tragedy of overreach. This reading is not wrong. It contains important truths. The military campaigns, the building of empire, the catastrophic Russian miscalculation, the final exile. These are real events with real consequences that shaped the world. But I have been circling throughout this story a different reading. Not instead of the first one. Alongside it, beneath it. The reading that interests me is about the relationship between achievement and meaning, about what it means to want something enormous and to get it, and to discover not immediately, not easily, not without profound resistance, that getting it does not resolve the question that the wanting was answering. Napoleon wanted from very early in his life to be equal to the most extraordinary models that history had offered him. Alexander, Caesar, the great commanders and legislators and world shapers of antiquity. He wanted to prove that the gap he had sensed in himself, the gap between what he contained and what the world had permitted him to express, was not self-delusion, that the measuring was accurate. He proved it, comprehensively, undeniably, by any measure one could apply. He was what he thought he was. The gap was real, and he crossed it. And then what? This is the question that Saint Helena forces into focus, not just for Napoleon, but for the rest of us watching. Because Napoleon's story is, in an important sense, the limiting case of a question that most of us face in less extreme forms. The question of what achievement is for, of whether the work of becoming, the sustained, effortful, painful work of developing your capacity and expressing it in the world, is itself the point, or whether it is in service of something beyond itself. If it is in service of something beyond itself, connection, legacy, love, the well-being of others, the gradual improvement of the world, then the achieving is embedded in a larger context that gives it meaning. The individual campaign, the individual victory, the individual act of creation or service is meaningful not just in itself, but as part of the larger web of its consequences and connections. If the achieving is itself the point, if the entire structure of your desire is organized around the forward motion, the gap closing, the relentless expression of capacity, then you have a different problem. Because achieving, when it is complete, when the gap is closed, should produce satisfaction. But if the gap was always the driver, then closing it doesn't produce satisfaction. It produces a new gap, and eventually, inevitably, there comes a point where the gap can't be opened again, where the world is too small, or you are too old, or the circumstances are too constraining. And then what? Napoleon seems to have faced this on Saint Helena in its starkest form. The man who had never stopped was stopped. The man who had organized his entire psychic life around the not yet was confined to a present that could not be transcended. And in that confinement, in those 6 years, there is evidence of genuine reflection, not just the propaganda of the memorial, not just the strategic self-presentation, but actual quiet, human thinking about the shape of a life and what it amounted to. He spoke about his son often, the King of Rome, now living in Vienna as Franz, raised as an Austrian prince, being carefully depoliticized by the Habsburg court that held him. Napoleon knew he would never see him again. He spoke about him in the specific way that parents speak about children they cannot reach, with a mixture of love and helplessness and the particular grief of understanding that the child's life is happening without you, is being shaped by forces you cannot influence. He spoke about Joséphine, about the years in Italy, the first campaign, the early marriage, about the quality of feeling he had for her, which he described in old age with more composure than he had possessed at 26, but with an emotional clarity that the composure made more rather than less moving. He said more than once that she was the great love of his life, that the divorce, whatever its political necessity, was a mistake, that the years of being married to her, turbulent and uncertain and painful as they were the years in which he had felt most alive in the register that has nothing to do with power or achievement. He also, on Saint Helena, showed something that the years of power had left little room for: uncertainty. Not the operational uncertainty that he had always handled with such brilliant calmness, not tactical doubt or strategic deliberation, but existential uncertainty. The uncertainty about whether any of it had been worth it. Whether the 600,000 men who had gone into Russia and the several 100,000 who had not come back had died in service of something that warranted the cost. Whether the wars he had fought, however brilliantly, however necessarily by the logic of the situation he had found himself in, had produced more good than harm in the aggregate. He didn't fully answer this. The memorial, as a public document, provides an answer, a self-exculpatory, carefully constructed answer. But in the private conversations recorded by his companions, there are traces of something more uncertain. Moments where the question lands without a ready response, where the great mind that had an answer for everything goes quiet. Have you ever been in the presence of someone who spent their life winning and who, in old age or in diminishment, confronted for the first time the question of what the winning was for? There is a particular quality to that confrontation. It is not defeat. It is something more complex and more human than defeat. It is the discovery that the question was always there, underneath the answers, waiting. Napoleon's contemporaries, even those who had opposed him, even those who had worked for decades to destroy his power, almost universally reported, when they encountered him in the final years, a sense of unexpected difficulty, of not being able to maintain the simple positions they had held at a distance. Metternich, who visited him at Elba, wrote that the experience left him more troubled than he had expected. Wellington, who apparently met Napoleon only once and briefly before the wars, said that he would have given up several infantry divisions for a general of Napoleon's quality, and that the loss of such a mind to an enemy was the sort of thing that made one question the categories of opposition and alliance. These responses are interesting not because they validate Napoleon. His crimes were real, his wars killed hundreds of thousands, his personal conduct in political opposition was frequently brutal, but because they point to something that the categories of historical judgment, hero, villain, great man, tyrant, struggle to accommodate. The experience of his actual presence, or of genuine engagement with his mind even at a distance, consistently produced in thoughtful people something more complicated than the positions they had arrived with, because the experience pointed to a possibility. The possibility of what human consciousness, when organized in a particular way and given a particular opportunity, could do. A demonstration, difficult, and in many respects terrible, but undeniable, of human potential at its far edge. And demonstrations of extreme human potential are always, in some way, disorienting to the people who encounter them, because they imply something about the space between what most people are and what a person can be. They imply that the gap, the old measuring gap, the gap that Napoleon had felt in himself and spent his life trying to close, is real. That it is not self-delusion when you feel it. That the distance between where you are and where the furthest edge of human achievement lies is genuinely vast. This is exhilarating, and it is also, if you sit with it honestly, vertiginous. What Napoleon did with his gap was extraordinary. What it cost him and others was enormous. Whether the exchange was worth it, whether the civil code and the educational institutions and the transformation of European governance are worth the Russian dead and the Spanish dead and the Egyptian expedition and the divorce of Joséphine and the son who grew up without a father and the fire that burned everything it touched, that question does not have a simple answer. It doesn't have a simple answer not because the question is unclear. The question is perfectly clear. It doesn't have a simple answer because the things being weighed are genuinely incommensurable. You cannot compare a legal framework that will govern the rights of hundreds of millions of people across 2 centuries with the suffering of specific individuals in specific places in specific years. There is no common unit. There is no scale. This is the problem with greatness. When greatness is of this kind, when it is purchased at this price, the terms of the transaction are not within any single person's authority to assess, and Napoleon, in his 6 years on Saint Helena, seems to have understood this. Not publicly, the public account remained the memorial, the constructed justification, the argument for the defense. But in private, in the quiet of a damp house on a remote island, in conversations with the handful of people who had chosen to share his exile, there are glimpses of a man who had stopped performing the answer and was sitting with the question. He died in May 1821. He was buried on Saint Helena, in a small valley called Seine Valley, or in the local French version of the name, the Geranium Valley, under a willow tree, in a grave without a name. The British refused to allow the inscription Napoleon on the stone, insisting his title be given as General Bonaparte. His companions refused this as well. The result was a nameless grave which, under the circumstances, was perhaps the most appropriate possible memorial for a man who had always been partly beyond the names available for him. He remained there for 19 years. In 1840, under the July monarchy of King Louis Philippe, the French government negotiated with the British for the return of Napoleon's remains. It was a political masterstroke by Louis Philippe, who understood that rehabilitating the Napoleonic legend was the single most effective way to consolidate French national feeling in the unpredictable political climate of post-revolutionary France. The return of the remains was announced and became, for the French public, something close to a religious event. The ship that brought him back, the Belle Poule, arrived at Cherbourg in December 1840. The procession that carried his coffin from Cherbourg to Paris took place in bitter cold, along roads lined with hundreds of thousands of people who had come from across France. Old soldiers who had served with him, now in their 60s and 70s, stood at attention in the snow, Women held up their children to see the coffin pass. He was interred in the Invalides in the magnificent red porphyry sarcophagus that sits in the circular crypt, surrounded by the names of the campaigns that defined his era. It is one of the most visited sites in Paris. Millions of people have stood in that space and looked down at the sarcophagus from the gallery above in the specific quality of silence that great tombs produce, a silence that is part awe, part something harder to name, part the specific vertigo of standing over the remains of someone who changed the world. And then there is the grandson. This is the part of the story that circles back to the beginning in ways that Napoleon himself might have recognized with something between satisfaction and dread. Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the emperor, came to power in France in 1848, elected president in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, and then seized executive power in a coup in 1851, and was proclaimed emperor of the French in 1852. He ruled until 1870, when the Franco-Prussian War ended his reign. Napoleon III was not Napoleon I. This is historically obvious and also, at the level of personal psychology, a fascinating and slightly melancholy subject. He was a man who lived in the enormous shadow of a myth, who understood that his political capital was largely derived from the name and the legacy rather than his own achievements, who consciously styled himself as the heir of the Napoleonic tradition, and in doing so both invoked and diminished it. He was capable. He oversaw significant French economic development and urban transformation. Haussmann's rebuilding of Paris, the city of broad boulevards and coherent neighborhoods that we still navigate, was largely his project. He was a competent politician, but he was not, by any serious measure, the organizing intelligence that his uncle had been. The name was larger than the man, and the weight of it shaped his reign in ways that were visible to everyone around him. Marx, writing in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, one of the great pieces of political writing in the 19th century, gave the name to a general phenomenon. When history repeats itself, it repeats first as tragedy and then as farce. The original Brumaire, the coup that made Napoleon I the ruler of France, was tragedy in the classical sense, a story of extraordinary achievement corrupted by the flaws inseparable from its own greatness. The second Brumaire, the coup of Napoleon III, was, in Marx's reading, farce, the hollowed-out repetition of a form whose content had been exhausted. This is a brilliant observation, but I wonder if it is entirely fair, not to Napoleon III specifically, but to the pattern it describes. The repetition of historical forms is not always farcical. Sometimes it is genuinely necessary. The later artist who works in the tradition of a great predecessor, acknowledging the debt and trying to extend rather than replace, performing a kind of continuation rather than origination. The problem arises when the gap between the form and the content, between the name of the achievement and the achievement itself, becomes too visible. When the monument is mistaken for the man. Napoleon I was both man and monument simultaneously, and the monument was his own construction, built in parallel with the achievement. Napoleon III was mostly monument, inheriting what he had not built, and the gap showed. But the ghost walked regardless. The Napoleonic idea, the idea of France as the heir of the revolution of the state, as the rational organization of popular sovereignty, of the citizen as the bearer of rights independent of birth, this idea survived Napoleon III as it had survived Napoleon I. It walks still. The 20th century has its own complicated relationship with Napoleon. In the period between the wars, there were people, intelligent, sober people, not just ideologues, who drew comparisons between Napoleon and the totalitarian leaders of the 1930s. Mussolini consciously modeled aspects of his public persona on Napoleon. Hitler, more terrifyingly, had his own relationship with the Napoleonic legend, though it was mixed with enough contempt and enough fundamental difference in nature that the comparison is more misleading than illuminating. The French historians of the Vichy period had complex and shameful engagements with the Napoleonic legacy that later scholars have carefully unpicked. The comparison between Napoleon and the 20th century totalitarians is one that serious scholars treat with great caution, and rightly so. The differences matter as much as the similarities. Napoleon's relationship to the Enlightenment, to reason, to the idea of governance by merit rather than by racial or national mythology, these distinctions are fundamental, not cosmetic. He was an authoritarian, but he was an authoritarian of a specific and historically particular kind, rooted in the specific contradictions of the revolutionary era, not in the apocalyptic racial fantasies of the fascist tradition. But the question that the comparison forces into focus, the question of whether and when the scale of a person's historical achievement creates, as a necessary byproduct, the conditions for extraordinary harm, that question is not going away. It is not resolved by distinguishing Napoleon from Hitler, though the distinction is real and important. It is a permanent feature of the landscape of great power and great agency. How much damage is acceptable in service of genuine improvement? How many broken eggs is the omelet worth? Who gets to decide? And what happens to the person who decides? To the inner life of someone who accepts that the cost of the work they are doing is being borne by others who did not agree to bear it. Napoleon's inner life, as we have traced it through these hours, was not untouched by these questions. The silences in the Egyptian desert, the grief over lands, the quality of the private journals in 1813, the nameless grave in the Geranium Valley, these are not the data points of a man who was simply indifferent to the cost of his ambition. They are the evidence of a man who carried that cost in a particular register. A private register, real but carefully contained, felt but not permitted to interrupt the functioning. Whether that is nobility or callousness, whether the capacity to keep moving in the presence of enormous grief and doubt is a form of strength to be admired or a form of armor to be mourned, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I've spent a long time with this question, and I've arrived at the conclusion that it is not a question that has a single, clean answer. It is the kind of question that keeps its shape no matter how long you look at it, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about Napoleon, that he is a question that keeps its shape. The willow tree is gone, the one that stood over Napoleon's grave on Saint Helena, in the small valley where they buried him without a name. The original willow died in the 19th century, and what stands there now is a tree planted later, in commemoration, carrying the form of the original rather than its substance, honoring the place where he lay for 19 years with a shape that looks like history, but isn't the original wood. There is something appropriate about this. The place that held his body for 19 years, and the tree that held its shape for nearly 200, both of them participating in the same strange operation that great lives always require of the world, the holding of something that is no longer present as if it still were, the maintenance of a form for something that has passed through and left. Saint Helena is still a remote island. It is still small, still reached only with difficulty, still possessed of the dramatic volcanic landscape and the damp, mercurial weather that made the 6 years there difficult for someone accustomed to the density and movement of continental Europe. You can visit it. Some people do, following the trace of Napoleon's last years through the rooms of Longwood now restored and managed by the French government through the valley where he was buried, along the roads and paths he walked on his permitted excursions. What do people find there? What are they looking for, making that difficult journey to a small island in the South Atlantic? I think they are looking for what most people look for when they seek out the places where extraordinary lives were lived. Some residue, some trace of the quality of consciousness that moved through that space. Some confirmation that it was real, that the scale of what they've read about the density of the life they've tried to imagine was actually present in this specific physical location, breathed this specific air, looked at these specific hills. The trace is never quite there. That's not how it works. The place is a place. Stones and walls and views and weather. The consciousness that moved through it is gone entirely as all consciousness goes, leaving only its effects in the world. The code, the campaigns, the transformation of European governance, the resonance in the work of the artists and thinkers and revolutionaries who came after the particular quality of the question that his life continues to ask. But the seeking is not foolish. The seeking is how we do something important. We try to close the distance between ourselves and another person's inner experience. We try to understand not just what they did, but what it was like, what it felt like from the inside, what the inner weather was, not the battles and the legislation and the campaigns, but the experience of being the person who did those things. The experience of waking up every morning as Napoleon Bonaparte, carrying that specific interior, facing that specific horizon. We seek that because we are, at some level, doing a similar thing ourselves, on a much, much smaller scale, in entirely different circumstances, with entirely different instruments. But the structure is recognizable, the awareness of a gap between what you are and what you might be. The question of what you are capable of, the sense that the work of becoming, the sustained, effortful, sometimes painful work of developing and expressing your capacity is important, is worth the cost, is somehow the most real thing you do. Napoleon made that gap visible at a scale and an intensity that has no equal in the modern historical record. He demonstrated, in ways that could not be explained away or miniaturized, that the gap is real. that the distance between ordinary functioning and the far edge of human possibility is genuinely vast, and that someone willing to cross that distance, paying the price it costs, can move the world. He also demonstrated, and this is the part that is harder to look at, but that may be more useful, what the crossing costs, not just the external cost, the wars and the exile and the suffering of others, the internal cost, the cost of never being fully at rest, of living always in the future, of being in some fundamental sense too much for the present to contain, of achieving everything you set out to achieve and discovering that achievement in itself is not the answer to the question that drove you, that the answer was somewhere in the direction of the question, in the relationships, the ordinary moments of human connection, the things that don't leave monuments but that leave a different kind of trace, and that in the pursuit of the extraordinary, the ordinary was what went missing, and what went missing at the end was what remained. When the empire was gone, when Joséphine was gone, when the sun was unreachable, when the fire had burned everything combustible, and what was left was a quiet valley and a willow tree, and 6 years of the closest thing to ordinary life that Napoleon had ever known. He wrote letters, he played chess, he told stories to the people around him. He was kind, by multiple accounts, to the children he encountered. He walked when he was able, looking at the sea. The sea was always visible on Saint Helena. From almost every point on the island you can see it. The immense, indifferent South Atlantic stretching in all directions toward horizons that must have felt. To a man who had crossed the Alps and the Egyptian desert and the Russian steppe, both familiar and finally still. There is a quality of stillness that is not peace, that is not contentment or resignation or the easy acceptance of what is. It is the stillness of a man who has traveled to the edge of what was possible and stands there, looking outward, and is no longer measuring, no longer asking the question, not because the question has been answered, but because the asking, for the first time in a life organized entirely around it, has stopped. He looked at the sea. It did not answer him. The sea never answers. It simply continues, enormous and indifferent, its horizon always exactly as far as it is, retreating as you approach, never arriving. Always arriving. He had spent his whole life approaching that horizon. He had gotten closer than anyone. And the distance at the end was exactly what it had always been. The fire went out on a May evening in 1821. The weather on Saint Helena that day was, by the accounts of those present, overcast and cool. The light was flat and gray in the particular way that island light sometimes goes when the sky closes over. Outside, the geraniums in the valley were probably in flower. The valley kept its name from them, the small persistent flowers that grew along the edges of the paths, unimpressed by history, indifferent to greatness, going about their patient, ordinary business of being alive. He had been the most powerful man on earth. He had remade the law and the roads and the schools. He had stood at the pyramids of Giza and looked at something 4,000 years old. He had crossed the Alps in winter. He had entered Moscow in silence. He had stood in the road and offered his life to the guns of men who chose instead to follow him. He had loved one woman who did not fully love him back, and he had loved her his whole life. He had asked from the beginning, what is the limit? He found it. Not on a battlefield, not in Russia, not in the exile. He found it in the same place every human being eventually finds it, in the simple, inevitable fact of a life that runs out of time, in the afternoon light on a remote island in the South Atlantic, in the room where the people who had chosen to stay with him were gathered, and the sea was somewhere outside, and the geraniums were flowering, and the question finally went quiet, not answered. Quiet, which may be the only resolution that was ever available, which may, in the end, be enough.